The silence in that room was deafening. 23 family members packed into Grandma Evelyn's living room, and you could hear a pin drop. My cousin Derrick stood frozen, his thick fingers still gripping the fake document he'd just waved around like some kind of victory flag. The lawyer, Mr. Bennett, had just pulled out the real paperwork from his leather briefcase, and the words he'd spoken hung in the air like smoke. From Sunday morning incense, the apartment was legally transferred to Marcus Johnson 6 months before Mrs. Evelyn's passing. I watched Derrick's face change in real time. The cocky smirk that had been plastered there for the past hour melted away like ice cream on hot asphalt. His gold chains caught the afternoon light streaming through Grandma's lace curtains as his chest rose and fell with rapid, angry breaths. For 34 years, this man had bulldozed his way through family gatherings, convinced that being the oldest grandson meant he was entitled to everything. He'd spent the last week telling anyone who'd listen that he was taking over Grandma's place, that he'd earned it by helping her out financially over the years. What he didn't know was that Grandma Evelyn saw right through him. What he didn't know was that she'd been watching all of us for decades, taking mental notes, measuring our character when we thought nobody was paying attention. What he didn't know was that 6 months ago, when she'd called me over for what I thought was just another Sunday dinner, she'd handed me a manila envelope and said, "Marcus, baby, this is yours now. Don't tell nobody yet, but when the time comes, you'll know what to do." Aunt Reese was the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, is that true?" All eyes turned to me, and I felt the weight of 23 pairs of expectations pressing down on my shoulders. Some faces showed surprise, others confusion, and a few, particularly my Uncle Jerome and Aunt Patricia, showed something that looked dangerously close to relief. But Derrick? Derrick looked like he was about to explode. His nostrils flared as he stared at me across that crowded room, the same room where Grandma used to make us recite poetry every Christmas, where she'd tell us stories about our ancestors who'd built this community from nothing, the same room where she'd pull me aside when I was young and whisper, "Education is the only inheritance they can't steal from you, Marcus. Remember that?" Now I understood why she'd said it. Mr. Bennett cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. Mrs. Johnson was very specific about her wishes. She wanted to ensure the property would be in the hands of someone who would honor her legacy and serve the community. His professional composure never wavered, even as the tension in the room threatened to boil over. That's when Derrick finally found his voice again, though it came out as more of a growl. "This is some bullshit, Marcus. You know damn well I'm the one who what?" The words left my mouth before I could stop them, and suddenly 30 years of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed by this man came rushing to the surface. The one who showed up here every few months asking for money? The one who never once asked how she was feeling, just how much she had in the bank? The room erupted. "Hey everyone, before we dive deeper into this story, I'm curious. What city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. I love seeing where my viewers are tuning in from around the world." 3 days earlier, I stood in the back row of Mount Olive Baptist Church, watching people file past Grandma Evelyn's casket like they were paying homage to a queen. And in many ways they were. For 78 years, Evelyn Johnson had been the backbone of Auburn Avenue, the woman who organized block parties, mediated neighbor disputes, and somehow always knew when someone needed a hot meal or a listening ear. The church was packed beyond capacity. Folks who hadn't spoken in years were sitting shoulder to shoulder, united in their grief for a woman who'd touched every life in this corner of Atlanta. Pastor Williams delivered a eulogy that had grown men crying openly, talking about how Grandma had personally funded 3 kids' college educations and never asked for a dime back, how she'd opened her doors during Hurricane Katrina to displaced families who needed somewhere to stay, how she'd marched with Dr. King as a young woman and still carried that fire for justice in her heart until the very end. I tried to focus on the pastor's words, tried to let the gospel music wash over me like it always did, but I kept getting distracted by the whispers happening 2 rows in front of me. Cousin Derrick was holding court with Uncle Jerome, Aunt Patricia, and a few other relatives, their voices low but their gestures animated. "Already got the keys," I heard Derrick say, leaning in close to Uncle Jerome's ear. "Soon as we get through this funeral business, I'm gonna start cleaning the place out. Got some contractors coming Monday to look at renovations." My stomach dropped. "Contractors? Renovations? Grandma had been gone exactly 48 hours, and this man was already talking about gutting her home. Aunt Patricia nodded along, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that looked more for show than actual tears. Well, somebody's got to take charge. That apartment's worth good money now, what with all the gentrification happening on Auburn Avenue. Probably looking at $250, maybe $300,000 if you fix it up right. The casual way they talked about dollar signs while Grandma's body lay 10 feet away made my hands ball into fists. I thought about all the Sunday dinners when Derrick would show up unannounced, charming his way into Grandma's good graces with his smooth talk and fake concern. How he'd compliment her cooking while his eyes scanned the room, taking inventory of her antiques, her jewelry, anything valuable that might be worth something someday. But what really got to me was how the rest of the family just went along with it. Nobody questioned why Derrick assumed he had the right to make these decisions. Nobody asked what Grandma would have wanted. They just nodded and smiled like he was some kind of natural heir to her legacy. Marcus looks lost without her, Cousin Shanice whispered, glancing back at me with what I think was supposed to be sympathy. Poor thing's been living in books so long he probably don't even know how the real world works. Good thing Derrick's stepping up to handle the grown-up stuff. The condescension in her voice cut deep, but it wasn't anything new. That's how they'd always seen me. Marcus the dreamer, Marcus the teacher. Marcus who'd rather spend Saturday night grading papers than bar hopping. They looked at my simple clothes, my quiet demeanor, my choice to stay in the neighborhood and work at the local high school instead of chasing some corporate job in Buckhead. And they saw weakness. What they didn't see was the hours I'd spent with Grandma every week for the past 5 years, helping her organize her financial papers, driving her to doctor's appointments, listening to her stories about the old days. What they didn't see was how she'd grip my hand during those visits and tell me things she'd never shared with anyone else. About her fears for the neighborhood, her hopes for the next generation, her dreams of turning her apartment into something that could help preserve the community's history. You got something special in you, Marcus, she'd told me just last month, her voice weak but her eyes still sharp as ever. You understand that money ain't everything. You understand that some things are worth more than what you can sell them for. Now, watching my family treat her death like a business opportunity, I understood exactly what she'd meant. The service ended with Precious Lord, Grandma's favorite hymn, and as people began filing out, I noticed Derrick making his rounds, shaking hands and accepting condolences like he was the grieving head of household. Several people stopped to tell him they were sorry for his loss, and he accepted their sympathy with the gravitas of a man who'd truly lost his closest confidant. It would have been almost admirable if it wasn't complete bullshit. As I waited for the crowd to thin out, I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. Mrs. Henderson from down the hall had approached, her elderly face creased with genuine sorrow. Your grandmother talked about you all the time, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was so proud of the man you'd become, baby. So proud of how you stayed close, how you cared about the community the way she did. She paused, glancing around to make sure nobody was listening. She used to say you were the only one who really understood what she was trying to build here. Before I could ask what she meant by that, Mrs. Henderson squeezed my shoulder and shuffled away, leaving me standing alone in the back of that big church, with a growing sense that there was more to this story than anyone realized. That evening, at the repast held in the church fellowship hall, the whispers got louder. Derrick had positioned himself near the food table, accepting everyone's sympathies while simultaneously dropping hints about his plans for the property. I watched him work the room like a politician, promising Uncle Jerome that there'd be plenty for everyone, once things were handled properly, assuring Aunt Patricia that he'd make sure Grandma's memory was honored while the place was brought up to modern standards. By the time I left that night, half the family was convinced that Derrick inheriting the apartment was not just likely but inevitable. The other half seemed to assume it had already happened. None of them thought to ask me what I knew. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and a dozen text messages, all saying essentially the same thing. Family meeting at 2 p.m., Grandma's apartment, mandatory attendance. The messages came from different relatives, but they all had the same energy, like we were being summoned to court rather than invited to discuss our grandmother's final wishes. I spent the morning grading papers and trying to prepare myself mentally for what I knew was coming. My students at Frederick Douglass High School had been incredibly understanding about my need for time off, and Principal Washington had even sent flowers to the funeral. These kids, most of them from the same neighborhood where Grandma had lived her whole life, understood loss in a way that made my heart ache. Some of them had been to more funerals than birthday parties, and they showed a maturity about death that no teenager should have to develop. "Mr. Johnson," Keisha had said to me after class on Friday, "my grandmama always told me that the dead stay with us as long as we remember their lessons." What lessons your grandmama leave you with? The question had stayed with me all weekend. What lessons had Grandma left me? Integrity over profit, community over self-interest, the long game over quick wins. Looking back now, I realized she'd been teaching me those lessons my entire life, preparing me for a moment I didn't even know was coming. When I arrived at the apartment at 1:45, the hallway was already buzzing with activity. Derrick's voice carried through the door as he held court with early arrivals, his tone confident and commanding. I could hear Aunt Patricia's laugh, that high-pitched trill she saved for when she was trying to impress someone or get something she wanted. I took a deep breath and used my key to let myself in. The living room had been rearranged. Grandma's favorite armchair, the one where she'd sat every evening watching the news and shaking her head at the state of the world, had been pushed into a corner to make room for folding chairs borrowed from someone's church. Her coffee table, usually adorned with her collection of ceramic angels and a well-worn Bible, had been cleared off and positioned like a conference table in the center of the room. Derrick stood near the window, gesticulating as he explained something to Uncle Jerome and Cousin Ray. He dressed for the occasion in dark slacks and a button-down shirt, though he'd left it open just enough to show off his gold chain. His presence filled the room in a way that demanded attention, and I could see how easily the older relatives deferred to his authority. "Marcus," Aunt Patricia called out when she spotted me, her voice saccharine sweet. "Come on in, baby. We were just talking about how blessed we all are to have Derrick here to help us navigate all this complicated legal stuff." I nodded politely and found a seat near the back, content to observe for now. More relatives continued to filter in over the next 15 minutes. Cousins, aunts, uncles, even a few family friends who Grandma had considered close enough to include in important decisions. By 2:15, the room was packed with nearly 24 people, all looking expectantly at Derrick as he positioned himself at the head of the makeshift conference table. "Y'all, first let me say how grateful I am that everyone could make it today," he began, his voice taking on the practiced tone of someone used to being listened to. "Grandma Evelyn meant the world to all of us, and I know she'd be happy to see the family coming together like this, to make sure her final wishes are respected." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Cousin Shanice dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Uncle Jerome nodded gravely. "Now, I know this is a difficult time," Derrick continued, "but we got business to handle. Grandma's apartment, her belongings, her finances. Somebody's got to step up and take responsibility for making sure everything's handled properly." He paused for dramatic effect, letting his eyes sweep across the room before landing on me for just a moment. There was something in that look. Not quite a challenge, but definitely a assertion of dominance. Like he was daring me to speak up, confident that I wouldn't. "I've been thinking and praying about this a lot," he said, resuming his speech. "And I believe the good Lord put it on my heart to take care of Grandma's legacy. Y'all know I was always one of her favorites. Always the one she called when she needed something fixed or when she needed help with her bills." That last part made my jaw clench. Derrick had helped with Grandma's bills the same way a loan shark helps with financial difficulties, by creating dependency and expecting something in return. Aunt Patricia and Uncle Jerome, they can vouch for how much time I spent here. How close me and Grandma were, he continued, gesturing to the relatives who'd been nodding along with his every word. "She used to always tell me, 'Derrick, baby, you got that business sense. You understand how the world works.'" More nods and murmurs of agreement. I watched as Derrick worked his magic, painting himself as the natural heir to Grandma's estate while positioning the rest of us as supporting characters in his narrative. "So here's what I'm thinking," he said, his voice taking on a more businesslike tone. "The apartment's worth good money, probably close to $300,000 with the right improvements. The furniture and jewelry might bring in another $10,000–15,000 if we sell it right. Her bank accounts, her life insurance, all that needs to be handled by someone who understands legal procedures and paperwork." He was talking about liquidating Grandma's entire life, like it was a stock portfolio, and most of the room was eating it up. I saw dollar signs reflected in several pairs of eyes as relatives started mentally calculating their potential shares of the windfall. Now, I know some of y'all might be thinking this sounds like a lot for one person to handle, Derrick said, his tone becoming magnanimous. And you're right. That's why I want everyone to know that once we get everything sorted out, once we maximize the value of what Grandma left behind, we're gonna make sure everyone gets their fair share. This ain't about me getting rich. This is about honoring our grandmother's memory and taking care of the family like she would have wanted. The applause that followed made my stomach turn. Here was a man who'd spent years treating Grandma like a personal ATM, who'd shown up to family gatherings only when he needed money, or wanted to show off some new expensive toy he'd bought, and now he was being celebrated as the family savior. Does anybody have any questions or concerns about this plan? Derrick asked, his tone suggesting that questions or concerns would be unwelcome. That's when I finally spoke up. I have a concern, I said quietly. But my voice carried across the suddenly silent room. Every head turned toward me, and I felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. Derrick's expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something, annoyance, across his features. "What's that, Marcus?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "My concern is that we're sitting here dividing up Grandma's belongings when none of us has seen her will or her legal papers," I said, standing up slowly. "My concern is that we're making assumptions about what she wanted without actually knowing what she wanted." The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Aunt Patricia shot me a look that could have frozen water. "Marcus, baby," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I know this is hard for you, but Derrick's just trying to help us all figure out the practical stuff. Somebody's got to make the tough decisions." "I understand that," I replied, keeping my voice level. "But shouldn't we wait to see what legal documents exist before we start making decisions about anything?" Derrick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern, I really do. But somebody's got to step up and handle business. I've already been in touch with lawyers, already started looking into the legal requirements for estate management. While you've been," he paused, letting his eyes sweep over my simple clothes, my teacher's salary wardrobe. "While you've been dealing with your grief. I've been handling the real-world stuff that needs to get done." The dismissal in his tone was unmistakable, and I could see several relatives nodding along with his logic. To them, Derrick's expensive clothes and confident demeanor were signs of competence, while my quieter approach suggested weakness or inability to handle important matters. But what none of them knew was that I'd been handling Grandma's real-world stuff for years. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence after my question about the legal documents. I could feel the tension ratcheting up like a pressure cooker about to explode, and the expressions on my family members' faces ranged from annoyed to downright hostile. Clearly, I'd committed some sort of social crime by suggesting we slow down and actually follow proper procedures. Derrick let the silence stretch for a few beats, his eyes never leaving mine. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of forced patience you use with a child who's asking too many questions during an important adult conversation. "Look, Marcus, I get it. You're hurting right now. We all are." He gestured broadly at the room, including everyone in his circle of understanding while simultaneously positioning me as the outsider. "But grief can cloud our judgment sometimes. Make us overthink things that should be straightforward." Cousin Shanice nodded emphatically. "That's right. Poor Marcus has been so close to Grandma, this has got to be extra hard on him." The way she said "close to Grandma" made it sound like a character flaw, like my relationship with our grandmother was somehow excessive or unhealthy. I felt heat rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Grandma had always taught me that the loudest person in the room was rarely the smartest one. "Derrick," Uncle Jerome chimed in, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd appointed himself family elder. "You said you already talked to lawyers? What did they tell you about the process?" This was exactly what Derrick had been waiting for, a chance to demonstrate his competence and forward thinking while making me look naive and unprepared. He straightened his shoulders and adopted the confident posture of a man delivering important news. "Well, Uncle Jerome, it's pretty standard stuff. When someone dies without a will, and let's be real, Grandma wasn't exactly the type to hire expensive lawyers and file complicated legal documents, the estate goes through probate court. Typically, it gets distributed to the next of kin based on state law and who can demonstrate they were closest to the deceased. He was speaking with such authority that even I almost believed him for a moment. The problem was, almost everything he'd just said was either misleading or completely wrong. But I could see from the nods around the room that his confident delivery was more convincing than any actual facts would have been. Now, I've been researching this, Derrick continued, pulling out his phone and scrolling through what looked like legal websites. In Georgia, when there's no will, the estate typically goes to children first, then grandchildren if there are no living children. Since Grandma's only child, our daddy, passed away 10 years ago, it comes down to us grandchildren. More nods. Several relatives were hanging on his every word like he was delivering gospel truth. And among the grandchildren, he said, his voice taking on a tone of reluctant responsibility, the court usually favors whoever can show they had the closest relationship with the deceased and whoever's most capable of managing the estate responsibly. That's when Cousin Ray jumped in with his support. Well, that's obviously Derrick. Man's got his own business, knows how to handle money and property. Plus, he was always over here helping Grandma out. That's right, Aunt Patricia added quickly. Derrick was the one she'd call whenever something needed fixing. Whenever she needed help with her bills or her car or any of that grown-up stuff. I watched this orchestrated performance with growing amazement. They were rewriting history in real time, transforming Derrick's sporadic visits into evidence of devoted caregiving, turning his occasional financial help, which usually came with strings attached, into proof of his reliability and generosity. What about Marcus? Asked Cousin Nicole, the youngest person in the room at barely 22. Didn't he spend a lot of time with Grandma too? The question caught everyone off guard, and I saw Derrick's jaw tighten slightly. He'd been building momentum, painting himself as the obvious choice, and Nicole's innocent question threatened to disrupt his narrative. Oh, Marcus is a sweet boy, Aunt Patricia said quickly, her tone dripping with condescension. And he loved spending time with Grandma, listening to her stories and all that. But Marcus is... She paused, searching for the right words. Marcus is more of a dreamer, you know? He lives in his books and his classroom. He don't really understand how the world works outside of school. That's not fair to say about Marcus. Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the room like a knife. I'd been so focused on my immediate family that I hadn't noticed her slip in during the discussion. She must have been invited as one of Grandma's closest friends, and her presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. Evelyn talked about Marcus all the time, she continued, her elderly voice carrying surprising strength, about how he was the only one who really listened when she talked about preserving the community's history, how he understood what this place meant to her beyond just its financial value. Derrick's expression darkened. With all due respect, Mrs. Henderson, we're talking about legal and financial matters here. It's sweet that Marcus and Grandma shared interests in history and community and all that, but managing an estate requires practical skills, business experience, the ability to make tough decisions and handle complicated paperwork. What paperwork? I asked quietly, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. Excuse me? Derrick's tone sharpened. What paperwork are you planning to handle? I repeated louder this time. You keep talking about legal requirements and complicated procedures, but what specific paperwork are you referring to? The room went dead quiet. I could see several relatives shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, suddenly aware that they'd been nodding along with assertions they didn't really understand. Derrick's mouth opened and closed a few times before he found his voice. Well, there's the probate court filings, the estate inventory, the property transfer documents. He was clearly making it up as he went along, throwing out legal-sounding terms that he probably Googled that morning, but his confident delivery was starting to falter under the weight of my direct questioning. And you've already filed these documents? I pressed. Well, no, not yet. The legal process takes time. There's waiting periods and... Then how do you know there's no will? The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Everyone in that room suddenly realized that Derrick had been speaking with absolute certainty about things he couldn't possibly know for sure. Marcus, Uncle Jerome said, his voice carrying a warning tone. What are you trying to say? I'm saying that maybe we should wait to hear from Grandma's actual lawyer before we start dividing up her belongings and making plans for her property. Her lawyer? Aunt Patricia's voice rose to a near shriek. Marcus, honey, this is real life, not one of your history books. Working-class folks like us don't have lawyers on retainer. That's when the room exploded into arguments. Half the family was yelling at me for being difficult and unrealistic, while the other half was suddenly questioning whether Derrick actually knew as much about legal procedures as he'd claimed. Voices rose and overlapped until the words became an incomprehensible storm of accusations and demands. Through it all, Derrick stood at the head of that coffee table, his confident facade beginning to crack as he realized that his smooth presentation was falling apart. The gold chain around his neck caught the afternoon light streaming through Grandma's lace curtains, and for a moment he looked less like a competent family leader and more like what he'd always been, a man who'd learned to use charm and intimidation to get what he wanted. "Y'all need to calm down," he finally shouted over the chaos. This is exactly what Grandma wouldn't have wanted, the family fighting and arguing instead of coming together. The irony of that statement coming from the man who'd walked into this meeting planning to appropriate our grandmother's entire estate was apparently lost on him, but it wasn't lost on me. Just as the shouting match reached its peak, with Aunt Patricia wagging her finger in my face while Uncle Jerome tried to restore order, we heard 3 sharp knocks at the door. The sound cut through the chaos like a judge's gavel, and every voice in that crowded living room fell silent simultaneously. For a moment, nobody moved. We all stood frozen in our various positions of argument, Derrick with his hands raised trying to calm everyone down, Cousin Ray halfway out of his chair ready to either defend or attack someone, Mrs. Henderson clutching her purse like she was preparing to use it as a weapon. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Who the hell could that be?" Derrick muttered, clearly annoyed at the interruption. He'd been in the middle of reasserting his authority when the knocks had derailed his momentum. I felt my heartbeat quicken, though I couldn't have explained why. Something about those knocks felt significant, like they marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "I'll get it," I said, starting toward the door. "No, I got it," Derrick countered quickly, moving to block my path. "This is family business. Could be reporters or nosy neighbors trying to..." But before he could finish his sentence, a deep, authoritative voice called through the door. "This is Charles Bennett, attorney for the late Evelyn Johnson. I'm here for the family meeting that was scheduled for 2 p.m. You could have heard a pin drop. Derrick's face went through about 15 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and something that looked distinctly like panic. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air as the implications of that announcement sank in. "Attorney?" Aunt Patricia whispered, her voice barely audible. Evelyn had an attorney? Mrs. Henderson, who'd been quietly observing the family drama from her chair near the window, allowed herself a small smile. "Evelyn was a lot more prepared than y'all gave her credit for." I walked to the door, my legs feeling strangely unsteady. When I turned the deadbolt and pulled it open, I found myself face to face with exactly the kind of man you'd want representing your interests in a legal matter. Charles Bennett stood about 6 feet tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. His wire-rimmed glasses and closely trimmed beard gave him an air of scholarly authority, while his confident posture suggested this wasn't his first time delivering important news to a room full of anxious relatives. "Mr. Johnson?" he asked, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Yes, sir, I'm Marcus Johnson." "Ah, Marcus," he said, and something in his tone suggested my name wasn't unfamiliar to him. "I'm very sorry for your loss. Your grandmother spoke of you often." Before I could process what that meant, he was stepping into the apartment, his keen eyes scanning the room and taking in the scene. The folding chairs arranged like a courtroom, the family members frozen in various states of argument, and most notably, Derrick still standing at the head of the coffee table like a general whose army had suddenly abandoned him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Bennett announced, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I apologize for the interruption, but I understand you're gathered here to discuss Mrs. Evelyn Johnson's final arrangements." He set his leather briefcase down on Grandma's coffee table, the same table that Derrick had been using as his command center, and began methodically removing documents. The sound of papers rustling was the only noise in that room. Everyone else seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. "Now," Mr. Bennett continued, his tone professional but not unkind, "I know this might come as a surprise to some of you, Mrs. Johnson was a very private person about her legal affairs, but she was also extremely thorough and forward-thinking when it came to protecting her family's interests. Derrick finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "Excuse me, Mr. Bennett, but I think there might be some confusion here. We weren't expecting any lawyers, and Grandma never mentioned having legal representation or any formal documents." The lawyer looked up from his papers, studying Derrick with the kind of calm assessment that probably made opposing counsel very nervous in court. "And you are?" "Derrick Johnson. I'm her grandson, her oldest grandson, and I've been handling her affairs for—" "I see." Mr. Bennett's tone gave nothing away, but something in his expression suggested he'd heard similar claims before. "Well, Mr. Johnson, I can understand your confusion. Mrs. Evelyn was quite specific about wanting to keep her legal preparations private until after her passing. She felt it would help avoid exactly the kind of family discord that can arise when large sums of money and valuable property are involved." He pulled out a thick folder bound with a red ribbon and set it prominently on the table. "This contains Mrs. Johnson's last will and testament, executed 18 months ago and updated as recently as 6 months ago. It also contains various other legal documents related to property transfers, financial accounts, and specific instructions for the distribution of her personal effects." The room was so quiet, I could hear the old radiator clicking in the corner, the same radiator that Grandma used to curse every winter when it got too hot or too cold. Several relatives had literally stopped breathing. Cousin Shanice's hand was frozen halfway to her mouth, clutching a tissue she'd been using to dab her eyes. "Now, before we review these documents," Mr. Bennett continued, "I want to make something very clear to everyone in this room. Mrs. Johnson spent considerable time and thought creating these legal arrangements. She consulted with me extensively about her options, her family situation, and her wishes for her legacy. Nothing in these documents was done hastily or without careful consideration." His eyes swept across the room, landing briefly on each family member before settling on Derrick. Mrs. Johnson was particularly concerned about ensuring that her property would remain in the hands of someone who shared her values and would honor her commitment to this community. "What kind of values?" Uncle Jerome asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Education, community service, integrity." Each word landed like a small hammer blow. Mrs. Johnson felt strongly that her legacy should support these principles rather than simply provide financial benefit to her heirs. I felt something stirring in my chest. Not quite hope, but definitely a recognition that this conversation was heading somewhere none of us had expected when we'd walked into this room. "She also," Mr. Bennett added, opening the red folder and removing a single sheet of paper, "wanted to ensure that her wishes were carried out by someone she trusted implicitly. Someone who had demonstrated over years of consistent behavior that they understood what was truly important to her." Derrick's face had gone ashen. "What exactly are you saying?" Mr. Bennett looked directly at him, his expression neutral but his words devastating. "I'm saying, Mr. Johnson, that your grandmother's estate planning was considerably more sophisticated than anyone in this room seems to have realized, and her decisions about who should inherit her property were based on factors that go far beyond birth order or financial need." He paused, letting that sink in before delivering the final blow. "Would you like me to read the relevant portions of the will aloud, or would you prefer to review the documents privately first?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since I'd walked into this meeting, I saw something in Derrick's eyes that I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. What happened next will be burned into my memory forever. Instead of answering Mr. Bennett's question about reading the will, Derrick did something that revealed the depths of his desperation and the lengths he was willing to go to maintain control of the narrative. Lunged forward and snatched one of the documents from the coffee table. "Hold up. Hold up," Derrick said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard from him before. Part panic, part desperation, and entirely unlike the confident man who'd been commanding the room just minutes earlier. "Before we start reading legal papers and getting all confused by lawyer talk, I think we need to establish some facts here." Mr. Bennett's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "Facts?" "Yeah, facts," Derrick repeated, waving the paper he'd grabbed like it was evidence in his favor. The irony that he was holding what was probably his own legal death sentence while using it to support his argument wasn't lost on me, even if it was lost on him. Fact number 1, he continued, his voice gaining strength as he fell back into his familiar pattern of manipulation. I've been taking care of Grandma for years. Years. Ask anybody in this room who was the one she called when her toilet was backed up. Who was the one she called when she needed money for her medicine? Who was the one who made sure she had food in her refrigerator and heat in the winter? He was building momentum now, feeding off the murmurs of agreement from some of the relatives. Uncle Jerome was nodding along, and I could see Aunt Patricia's expression softening as Derrick painted himself as the devoted grandson. Fact number 2, he said, pointing the document at Mr. Bennett like an accusation. Lawyers cost money. Expensive lawyers like you cost a lot of money. Where was Grandma supposed to get thousands of dollars to pay for legal services? She was living on Social Security and a small pension, barely making ends meet. Several heads in the room nodded at this logic. It was true that Grandma had been careful with money, always turning off lights when she left a room, always looking for sales at the grocery store. Derrick was using those frugal habits to suggest that hiring a lawyer would have been out of character for her. And fact number 3, he continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation, even if Grandma did talk to some lawyer at some point, even if she signed some papers, that don't change the fact that families are supposed to take care of each other. That don't change the fact that I'm the one with the experience and the resources to make sure her legacy is protected. He was good. I had to give him that. Even in the face of legal documents that probably destroyed his entire plan, he was managing to spin a narrative that made him look like the victim of some elaborate conspiracy against family values. Now, I don't know what kind of game is being played here, he said, his eyes scanning the room to make sure he had everyone's attention, but I do know that Grandma would be heartbroken to see us fighting over papers and technicalities instead of coming together as a family. That's when he made his master stroke. He turned to me with an expression of such manufactured concern that I almost believed it myself. Marcus, I know you're hurting, man. I know you miss Grandma just as much as the rest of us do. And maybe somebody convinced you that getting lawyers involved was the right thing to do. Maybe somebody told you that you needed to protect yourself or that you deserved something more than what the family was willing to give. You. The room was dead silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what he was suggesting, that I had somehow orchestrated this lawyer's appearance, that I was the one trying to manipulate the situation for personal gain. But Marcus, he continued, his voice taking on the tone of a big brother offering guidance to a wayward sibling, this ain't the way, man. This ain't what Grandma would have wanted. She would have wanted us to sit down together as a family and work things out like adults. I felt heat rising in my chest as I watched him work his magic on the room. Several relatives were now looking at me with suspicion, wondering if sweet, quiet Marcus had somehow hired this lawyer to challenge Derrick's rightful inheritance. I mean, think about it, Derrick said, warming to his theme. Who benefits from bringing lawyers into family business? Who benefits from making everything complicated and expensive? It ain't the family, that's for sure. It's the lawyers who get paid by the hour while we argue and fight. He gestured dismissively at Mr. Bennett, who had been observing this performance with the detached interest of a scientist studying an interesting specimen. So here's what I propose, Derrick said, his voice taking on the magnanimous tone of a leader offering compromise. Let's put aside all these papers and legal technicalities for now. Let's handle this the way Grandma would have wanted, as a family. Marcus, if there's something specific you want from Grandma's belongings, something with sentimental value, I'm sure we can work that out. But let's not let outside interests come between us. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. He'd managed to position himself as the devoted grandson who'd been caring for Grandma. Paint the legal proceedings as somehow illegitimate or suspect suggest that I was being manipulated by outside forces. Offer me a consolation prize, something with sentimental value, while keeping control of everything valuable. Frame his takeover of the estate as the family-friendly option, and it was working. I could see it in the faces around the room, the suspicion directed at me and Mr. Bennett, the sympathy for Derrick as the victim of legal complications, the nodding agreement with his call for family unity. That's all I ever wanted, he concluded, his voice heavy with emotion, was for us to handle this as a family, with love and respect for Grandma's memory. I never wanted lawyers and legal battles and all this conflict. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet moments. This wasn't the silence of shock or anticipation, this was the silence of a room full of people who'd been convinced they were witnessing a righteous man being persecuted by legal technicalities and family greed. Cousin Shanice was the first to speak. "Derrick's right. This don't feel right, bringing lawyers into family business. Grandma always said family should stick together," added Uncle Jerome. Even Mrs. Henderson looked uncertain now, glancing between me and Mr. Bennett like she was wondering if she'd misjudged the situation. That's when Derrick played his final card. He looked directly at me, his expression a masterpiece of manufactured hurt and disappointment. "Marcus, I love you like a brother, man. We all do. But if you can't find it in your heart to trust your own family, if you really think you need lawyers to protect yourself from the people who've known you your whole life." He shook his head sadly, letting the implication hang in the air. "Then maybe you ain't the man Grandma thought you were." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around the room, I could see relatives nodding in agreement, their expressions ranging from disappointed to openly hostile. In the span of 5 minutes, Derrick had transformed me from a grieving grandson asking reasonable questions into a greedy opportunist who'd betrayed his family's trust. But what really got to me wasn't the manipulation itself. It was how effective it was. These people had known me my entire life, had seen me spend countless hours with Grandma, had watched me choose teaching over more lucrative careers because I believed in serving the community. And yet, faced with Derrick's smooth performance, they were ready to believe that I was the problem. That's when I realized something that would change everything. Grandma had been preparing me for exactly this moment my entire life. Mr. Bennett had been silent through Derrick's entire performance, his expression unreadable as he watched my cousin work the room like a seasoned politician. But as the murmurs of agreement grew louder and the suspicious glances in my direction multiplied, I saw something shift in the lawyer's demeanor. His professional composure remained intact, but there was something in his eyes, not quite anger, but definitely a steely determination that suggested Derrick had just made a serious miscalculation. "Mr. Johnson," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the room's tension like a scalpel, "are you finished?" Derrick, still riding the high of his manipulative masterpiece, gestured broadly at the room. "I think I've said everything that needs to be said. Sometimes the truth is simple, you know? Sometimes family business should stay family business." "I see." Mr. Bennett picked up his briefcase and methodically began returning the scattered papers to their proper places. For a moment I thought he might actually be packing up to leave, and I felt a sinking sensation in my stomach. Had Derrick's performance been so convincing that even the lawyer was ready to walk away? But then Mr. Bennett did something unexpected. Instead of closing the briefcase, he pulled out a manila envelope I hadn't seen before, thick, sealed with red wax, and labeled in Grandma's distinctive handwriting. "Before I respond to your interesting interpretation of events," Mr. Bennett said, his tone still professionally neutral, but with an edge that made everyone in the room suddenly pay attention, "I think it would be appropriate to share something that Mrs. Johnson specifically asked me to read in the event that anyone questioned the legitimacy of her legal arrangements." He broke the wax seal with deliberate precision, the small crack of the wax echoing in the silent room like a gunshot. From the envelope, he extracted a single sheet of paper covered in Grandma's careful cursive handwriting. "This is a letter that Mrs. Johnson wrote 6 months ago," he announced, "specifically to be read to her family if there were ever any questions about her mental capacity, her legal decisions, or her reasons for choosing the arrangements she chose." Derrick's confident expression faltered. "Now wait a minute." "The letter is dated and witnessed," Mr. Bennett continued, ignoring the interruption. "Mrs. Johnson asked me to read it in her own words, so that there would be no confusion about her state of mind or her intentions." He adjusted his glasses and began to read in a clear, strong voice. "To my beloved family, if you are hearing this letter, it means that someone has questioned my legal arrangements or suggested that I was not capable of making important decisions about my own property and belongings. Let me be very clear. I am of sound mind and body as I write this, and every decision I have made about my estate has been carefully considered over many months of prayer and reflection." The room was dead silent. Several relatives had tears in their eyes at hearing Grandma's words, but I could see others, particularly those who'd been nodding along with Derrick's performance, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Want you all to know that I have been watching this family for 78 years, Mr. Bennet continued reading. I have seen who shows up when times are hard, and who only appears when there's something to be gained. I have seen who remembers family birthdays and who only calls when they need money. I have seen who treats me like a person worth listening to and who treats me like an ATM with stories. Uncle Jerome shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Aunt Patricia had gone pale. Some of you might think I'm too old to understand what goes on around me, but I want you to know that I see everything. I know who comes to visit because they enjoy my company, and who comes to visit because they're keeping track of my belongings. I know who asks about my health and who asks about my bank account. I know who listens when I talk about preserving our community's history and who gets bored and changes the subject. Derrick was no longer looking confident. His hands were clenched at his sides, and sweat was beginning to show on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the apartment. I have decided to leave my most valuable possessions to the person who has shown me, through years of consistent behavior, that he understands what really matters in life. Not money, not status, not the appearance of success, but education, integrity, and genuine care for others. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Around the room, family members were starting to piece together the implications of what they were hearing. Marcus has spent every Sunday afternoon with me for the past 5 years, not because I asked him to, but because he wanted to. He has listened to my stories about the old days, helped me organize my papers, and driven me to doctor's appointments without ever once asking for gas money or complaining about his time. When I told him about my dreams of preserving this community's history, he didn't roll his eyes or change the subject. He asked thoughtful questions and offered to help however he could. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I fought them back. This wasn't the time to break down. More importantly, Marcus has never once asked me about my will, my bank accounts, or what I plan to leave to whom. In 5 years of weekly visits, he has never brought up inheritance or money or property value. He has treated me like a person worth spending time with, not an investment in his future. The silence in that room was deafening. I could see the realization dawning on face after face as they understood that Grandma had been evaluating all of us for years, taking notes on our character when we thought nobody was paying attention. I know this decision will upset some family members who expected to inherit my property, Mr. Bennet continued reading. But I want you to understand that my decision was not made out of favoritism or emotion. It was made based on careful observation of who among my family members has the character, values, and integrity to handle this responsibility properly. Derrick finally exploded. "This is bullshit," he shouted, his careful composure completely shattered. Marcus put her up to this. He manipulated an old woman into Mr. Johnson. Mr. Bennet's voice cut through Derrick's outburst like a blade. "I'm going to stop you right there before you say something that could be considered defamatory." The lawyer's tone had changed completely. The professional neutrality was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. Mrs. Johnson was evaluated by 2 independent physicians during the process of creating her will, he continued, his voice hard as granite. Both certified that she was of completely sound mind and under no duress whatsoever. Furthermore, her decisions were made over the course of 18 months, with multiple opportunities to change her mind if she chose to do so. He set the letter down on the coffee table and looked directly at Derrick. But more to the point, Mr. Johnson, the property transfer you're so concerned about was completed 6 months ago. The apartment isn't part of Mrs. Johnson's estate because she transferred ownership to Marcus while she was still alive. The words hung in the air like a bomb, waiting to explode. The deed to this apartment has been in Marcus Johnson's name since March 15th of this year. Legally speaking, you're all guests in his home right now. The silence that followed Mr. Bennet's announcement was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of absolute, suffocating silence that follows a catastrophic event, when everyone's brain is struggling to process information that doesn't fit their understanding of reality. 23 people sat frozen in that living room, their faces cycling through the same sequence of emotions: confusion, disbelief, shock, and then, slowly, the dawning realization of what they'd just heard. Derrick looked like he'd been struck by lightning. His mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. The document he'd been waving around like evidence of his authority now hung limply from his fingers, as useless as a Confederate dollar. All the confidence, all the swagger, all the commanding presence he'd projected for the past hour had evaporated like morning mist. That's not possible," Aunt Patricia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Evelyn never said anything about. She never mentioned." Mrs. Johnson was very specific about wanting to keep the transfer private until after her passing, Mr. Bennett explained, his professional composure fully restored now that the truth was finally out. She felt it would prevent exactly the kind of family conflict we've witnessed here today. Uncle Jerome was shaking his head slowly, like he could somehow make the information go away through sheer force of denial. "But Derrick said, he told us that there weren't any legal documents, that Grandma didn't have lawyers." "Mr. Derrick Johnson said a lot of things today," Mr. Bennett replied, his tone carefully neutral but his meaning unmistakable. Very few of them were accurate. I watched my cousin's face as the full weight of his situation sank in. For the first time in my life, I saw Derrick Johnson truly powerless. All his schemes, all his manipulations, all his confident assumptions about his rightful inheritance destroyed by a simple, legal document he'd never known existed. But what happened next revealed something about Derrick's character that shouldn't have surprised me but somehow did. Instead of accepting defeat gracefully, instead of acknowledging that he'd been wrong about the situation, he doubled down on his anger and lashed out at everyone within reach. "This is some set-up bullshit," he snarled, his voice raw with rage and humiliation. "You all been planning this, haven't you? You and Marcus scheming behind the family's back, manipulating an old woman, Mr. Johnson." Mr. Bennett's voice cut through Derrick's rant like a judge calling for order. "I'm going to strongly advise you to stop talking before you say something that could expose you to legal liability." But Derrick was beyond caring about legal consequences. Years of entitlement and assumed superiority were crashing down around him, and he was desperate to find someone to blame for his humiliation. Nah, I see what this is," he continued, pointing an accusing finger at me. "Marcus been playing the long game, haven't you? Acting all quiet and humble, spending time with Grandma, earning her trust so you could steal what rightfully belongs to the whole family." The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because I could see some of the relatives nodding along with his logic. Even in defeat, even with legal documents proving him wrong, Derrick was still managing to plant seeds of doubt about my character and motivations. "You think you're so smart," he sneered, stepping closer to me in what I recognized as an attempt at physical intimidation. "You think because you got some papers that makes you better than the rest of us. That makes you worthy of something the rest of us ain't?" That's when something inside me finally snapped. 30 years of being dismissed, underestimated, and condescended to by this man came rushing to the surface, and I found my voice in a way I never had before. "You want to know what makes me worthy, Derrick?" I said, standing up to meet his challenge. "You want to know what I did to earn Grandma's trust?" The room held its collective breath as I stepped into the center of that circle of folding chairs. No longer the quiet teacher sitting in the back row, but a man who was finally ready to speak his truth. "I showed up," I said, my voice steady and strong. "Every Sunday for 5 years I showed up. Not when I needed money, not when I wanted something, not when it was convenient for me. Every single Sunday. Whether I was tired, whether I was busy, whether I had other things I'd rather be doing." I could see some of the relatives starting to remember those Sunday visits, starting to piece together a pattern they'd never really noticed before. I listened to her stories, I continued. The same stories she'd been telling for decades about growing up in Jim Crow, Georgia, about meeting Grandpa at a church social, about watching this neighborhood change over the years. I listened like it was the first time I'd heard them, because to her, they were important enough to keep telling. Cousin Shanice had tears in her eyes now, and even Uncle Jerome was looking uncomfortable as he remembered all the times he'd cut Grandma off mid-story or changed the subject when she started talking about the old days. I helped her pay bills not because I had money to spare. Y'all know, teachers don't make much, but because I wanted to make sure she could stay in her home, in the community she'd helped build. For as long as possible, I drove her to doctor's appointments, helped her organize her medications, made sure she had groceries when the weather was too bad for her to get out. I did it because she was my grandmother and I loved her, not because I expected to inherit anything. My voice was rising now. 5 years of quiet dedication finding its expression in words I'd never been able to say before. And you know what, Derrick? In all those hours I spent with her, In all those Sunday afternoons and doctor's visits and grocery store trips, you know what she never once talked about? Money, property values, investment opportunities. She talked about family, about community, about the importance of education and integrity and treating people with respect. I turned to face the room, making eye contact with each family member in turn. She talked about being disappointed in family members who only called when they needed something. She talked about being hurt by relatives who treated her like a source of financial support instead of a person worth knowing. She talked about worrying that everything she and Grandpa had worked to build would be destroyed by people who saw dollar signs instead of legacy. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. This wasn't shock or confusion or anticipation. This was the quiet of people who were being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their relationships. Mrs. Henderson was the first to speak, her elderly voice carrying across the room with surprising strength. Evelyn was right about you, Marcus. She always said you were the one who understood what really mattered. But I wasn't finished. I had 30 years of words backed up and they were finally flowing free. So you want to know what makes me worthy of Grandma's trust? I said, looking directly at Derrick. It's not that I'm better than anyone else in this room. It's that I loved her for who she was, not for what she could give me. In the aftermath of my words, something fundamental shifted in that crowded living room. The energy that had been building toward confrontation and conflict began to transform into something else entirely. Not agreement, necessarily, but a grudging recognition of truth that couldn't be denied or argued away. Derrick stood in the center of that circle of chairs, his gold chains catching the late afternoon sunlight that streamed through Grandma's lace curtains, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked truly defeated. Not angry, not scheming for his next move, just empty, like a balloon that had suddenly lost all its air. This ain't over, he said finally. But the words lacked any real conviction. It was the kind of threat you make when you know you've lost but can't bring yourself to admit it. Mr. Bennett, who had been observing this family drama with the detached professionalism of someone who'd seen similar scenes play out in countless living rooms, began methodically packing his documents back into his briefcase. Actually, Mr. Johnson, it is over, he said without looking up from his paperwork. The property transfer was completed months ago, properly filed with the county, and cannot be contested except under very specific circumstances that clearly don't apply here. He snapped the briefcase shut and stood, adjusting his suit jacket with the precision of a man who understood the power of appearance in legal matters. Marcus, he said, turning to me with something that looked almost like warmth in his professional demeanor. Your grandmother asked me to give you this when everything was settled. He handed me a sealed envelope, smaller than the others but somehow weightier in my hands. My name was written across the front in Grandma's careful cursive, along with 4 words that made my eyes burn with unshed tears. For when you're ready. She also asked me to remind you of something she told you many times over the years. Mr. Bennett continued, his voice softening slightly. She said you'd know what it meant when the time came. I did know. Even before I opened that envelope, I knew exactly what it would say. Because Grandma had been preparing me for this moment my entire life without me realizing it. As Mr. Bennett gathered his things and prepared to leave, family members began filing out of the apartment in small groups. Their conversations hushed and subdued. Some stopped to offer awkward condolences or half-hearted apologies for the day's events. Others simply left without making eye contact, uncomfortable with the revelations about their own relationships with Grandma. Uncle Jerome paused at the door, his expression conflicted. Marcus, he said, I want you to know, I think Evelyn made the right choice. I don't always understand your generation, all that education and community service stuff, but she saw something in you that maybe the rest of us missed. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And from Uncle Jerome, that meant something. Cousin Shanice was more direct. I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm sorry for how we talked to you today, and I'm sorry for not seeing what Grandma saw. She paused, wiping her eyes with the same tissue she'd been clutching all afternoon. Maybe you could tell us sometime about those Sunday visits, about the stories she told you. I feel like I missed out on a lot. By the time the last family member had left, only Mrs. Henderson and I remained in the apartment. The folding chairs were still arranged in their circle, looking strangely formal and out of place among Grandma's familiar furniture. The late afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that Grandma had kept polished to a shine for over 50 years. Mrs. Henderson approached me slowly, her elderly frame moving with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to navigate the world despite physical limitations. "Open it," she said softly, nodding toward the envelope still clutched in my hands. Evelyn spent weeks writing that letter. She wanted to make sure she got the words exactly right. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded 2 sheets of paper covered in Grandma's handwriting. As I read, I could hear her voice in every word, could picture her sitting at her kitchen table in the early morning hours, composing what she knew would be her final message to me. "My dearest Marcus," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then you've just lived through one of the most difficult days of your young life. You've probably been questioned, challenged, and maybe even attacked by people who should have supported you. You've probably wondered if standing up for what's right was worth the cost in family relationships and personal peace. Let me tell you something I learned from my own grandmother, who lived through slavery and Reconstruction and the early days of Jim Crow. Integrity is not convenient. Doing the right thing is rarely the easy thing, but it's always worth it in the end. I'm leaving you this apartment not because you're perfect, but because you're principled. Not because you're the smartest or the most successful, but because you understand that real success is measured by the positive impact you have on other people's lives. This building, this community, this corner of Atlanta that your grandfather and I helped build, it's all yours now. But it comes with responsibilities that go far beyond paying the mortgage and keeping the lights on. I want you to make this place a center of learning and community connection. Use that education of yours, use that teacher's heart to help preserve the stories and history of this neighborhood. Find ways to support the next generation of young people who are trying to make something meaningful of their lives. And Marcus, honey, don't let today make you bitter toward family. Some of them were disappointed today, and disappointment makes people say and do things they don't really mean. Give them time. Give them grace. Some of them will come around, and those relationships can be rebuilt stronger than before. Most importantly, remember what I always told you. Education is the only inheritance they can't steal from you. But now I'm adding something to that wisdom. Integrity is the only inheritance worth passing on. Use this gift wisely, baby. Use it to honor our family's legacy and to build something beautiful for the future. All my love always, Grandma Evelyn. P.S. There's a bank account with enough money to maintain the apartment for the next 5 years. The account number and bank information are in the filing cabinet, second drawer, in a folder marked for Marcus. Your grandfather always said a man should never inherit problems, only opportunities. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face freely. Mrs. Henderson had moved to the window, looking out at the street where children were playing in the gathering dusk, giving me privacy for this moment of overwhelming emotion. She knew, I whispered, more to myself than to Mrs. Henderson. She knew exactly what would happen today. She knew Derrick would challenge the inheritance, knew the family would question her decision, knew I'd have to defend myself in her memory. Mrs. Henderson turned from the window, her own eyes wet with tears. Evelyn was the smartest woman I ever knew. She understood people in a way that was almost scary sometimes. She told me months ago that leaving you this apartment would cause family drama, but she also said it was the only way to make sure her real legacy lived on. What do you mean, her real legacy? The old woman smiled, and for a moment I could see the young woman she'd been decades ago, when she first became friends with my grandmother. This apartment, this building, this whole block, it's not just property, Marcus. It's a piece of history. It's where Dr. King used to stay when he came through Atlanta in the early days. It's where your grandparents hosted strategy meetings for voter registration drives. It's where 3 generations of children learned to read at Evelyn's kitchen table. She gestured around the room, and suddenly I saw it differently, not just as my grandmother's home, but as a landmark, a sacred space that had played a role in shaping the community I'd grown up in. Evelyn didn't leave you a house, baby, Mrs. Henderson said softly. She left you a responsibility. She left you a chance to make sure that history doesn't get erased by gentrification and redevelopment. As the full weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not the burden of obligation, but the privilege of purpose. For the first time in my life, I understood exactly why I'd been put on this earth and what I was meant to do with the gifts I'd been given. That night, after Mrs. Henderson had gone home and I was alone in the apartment that was now legally mine, I sat in Grandma's favorite chair and looked around at the space that had shaped so many of my childhood memories. The ceramic angels on the coffee table seemed to catch the lamplight in their painted faces, and I could almost hear the echo of all the Sunday dinners, all the family gatherings, all the quiet conversations that had taken place within these walls. I thought about Derrick and the other family members, about the relationships that had been damaged today, and the ones that might eventually be healed. I thought about the students I taught every day, about the community I served, about the responsibility I'd inherited along with the property. And for the first time since Grandma's funeral, I felt something that had been missing for days: peace. Not the peace of getting what I wanted, but the peace of understanding what I was supposed to do with what I'd been given. The next morning, I would start making plans. Plans for turning part of the apartment into a community center. Plans for creating a scholarship fund in Grandma's memory. Plans for preserving the stories and history she'd spent her lifetime collecting. But that night, I simply sat in her chair and felt her presence surrounding me, guiding me toward the future she'd envisioned long before I was ready to see it myself.